Hello, everybody. For those who join us now, my name is Ingemar Vollenweider. I'm an architect and professor for urban design at the TU Dortmund and co-host of the Dortmund Architecture Days 2020. As you can imagine, we are really very happy that we could bring this fine little group together today. And yes, I really don't want to waste any time and will introduce shortly my guests. First, I have the pleasure to introduce Sabine von Fischer, architect and writer, currently editor for architecture and design at the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, NZZ. She has published internationally from short stories to scientific essays and architecture monographs. Most recently, a book on acoustics, even in architecture, which shows her interest into diverse fields of the architectural profession. So then I have the honor and hopefully the pleasure we'll see to present two architects about whom I only can say too much or not enough. So I will go for the shortest version possible that Koolhaas chose himself in his latest book about his current exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, about which we will talk a little bit later on, I guess. There it says RK, Koolhaas, is an architect and a writer. Hello, Ren. And correspondingly, Jacques Herzog is an architect and a thinker and partner of Pierre de Meuron. Great to have you all here. We invited you both together because we think you have something in common. And it's not your architectural fame, but a common theme, the discovery of the landscape or the countryside. And we won't go into the question who was first, but rather into potential similarities and differences. And finally, what we can learn out of it, with which strategies we should pursue to save the planet and to make the world a better place, which might not always be the same. We want to know if Rem is bored by cities. Now I try something, have a second, and I would like to share some few pictures if this works. No, it doesn't yet. No. Very quickly. We want to know if Rem is bored by cities, as he says in the introduction to his book, because...
Do you want me to answer right away? Not bored by cities. Huh?
You can you see it?
Yeah. And I was answering your question. I'm not bored by cities.
Not bored. Okay, great, thank you. Because you declared that they have lost their surprising quality and that we confront newness when we walk out into the countryside and leave the urban field. Great picture. And what happened to the interest of Jacques and Herzog de Meuron for the openness and sometimes uncanny openness of the periphery, in maybe the neo-realistic sense and tradition from Antonioni until to Fischli-Weiss, when he states that we have to think about mistakes in the past and that we have to correct them. So we have many questions. In the end, maybe it comes down to some major statements of you both. On the one hand, the future of the world is decided in the countryside. And on the other hand, Jacques and Adem's program, Building on the Build. Is there a conflict or a contradiction or not? If not, we might be out here pretty soon. I hope not, and I think it's more complicated. So now Sabine knows both of you, wrote about both of you, interviewed you. Yesterday, Jacques, about soon the reopened Stadtcasino here in Basel, and with Rem lately about his exhibition at the Guggenheim. So she is the perfect interviewer, and I would like to give her the screen.
So thank you for joining this dialogue. Thank you, Koolhaas. Thank you, Jacques, Herzog, for being here. Thank you, Anna and Ingemar, for organizing this entire day. So I will start the first question with what you have in common, and afterwards we come to the differences. So Jacques, Herzog, and Koolhaas, you both have received the Pritzker Prize, and even in subsequent years, just to show how parallel your careers are, in 2000, 2001, the Pritzker Prize is awarded for outstanding buildings for design work in architecture. And so you, both of you, had at many multiple scales, you have designed outstanding buildings. But then in the last decades, both of you in parallel have worked on the countryside. So I'll show the books, the outcome of Studio Basel's research led by Jacques Herzog and others, Attention the Countryside. This is the book from 2016. And then AMO and Rem Koolhaas have extensively researched the countryside worldwide, resulting in the exhibition at the Guggenheim that unfortunately closed soon after the opening, and is also documented partially in this little book published in 2020. So between these two, both of you have, or both of you claim you have found a blind spot in architecture. So my first question to you is this blind spot where no one looked at, is this a blind spot for architects? Is it architects who never looked at this countryside? Or do you claim that society as a whole has overlooked these zones of the globe?
Who do you want to speak first?
Your choice.
No, but please.
Yeah, please start. Koolhaas, start.
Basically, my interest is kind of really more political. I would not say that this is a blind spot. I also would not say it's a blind spot of architects. I'm simply saying that since 2007, when the UN warned everybody that in the current situation already 50% of mankind is living in cities, and that in 2030 or 50, that might be 80 or 80%, that would create a kind of completely insane situation, that the vast majority of mankind would be situated on very small areas, and a very small percentage of mankind would be left to manage the enormous majority of the territory. So it is really, that is the incentive of the entire effort. And it's nothing to do with claiming anything. It's also nothing to do with correcting blind spots. It's simply that observation that became highly alarming to me, and that was for me an important kind of reason to try almost on a political level to create a kind of corrective.
Jacques Herzog.
Well, it's a fact that we started to look at the landscape starting in 2000, when we started the portrait about Switzerland, and we always looked at the cities and the land at the same time. Switzerland is maybe, together with Holland, one of the most radical examples of totally urbanized landscapes. And maybe I'm alarmed from a different point of view. Of course, maybe only 2% of the territory, global territory, is occupied by cities, but almost everything, and increasingly much, is in fact controlled and organized by humans. And that's actually much more alarming in the future. It's not, I think, important to extend settlement into the landscape. It's not important to bring cities more in the landscape, but vice versa. We have to bring more landscape into the cities. And I think that especially Switzerland has been urbanized, you know, maybe not in a conventional way with cities, but with train lines, with electrical plants, with energy production, with even agriculture. The kind of picturesque aspect of Switzerland is highly artificial, actually is an extension of the urban into the landscape. And that's the reason why we started to research the landscape, the territory, the nature, whatever you may name it, from so early on, and insisted in that in our second publication, which is Achtung, the Landscape, that literally claims or asks to only permit construction on the already built. I mean, that's true not for the whole world, but that's true for Switzerland. Other countries, even Germany or France, already have much more empty and open land. So the politically spoken, it would be a little bit different. But from the principle side, it is basically what we would like to look at in the future.
So you both say that you have been alarmed and you want to create a corrective to the practices. So you're still doing this as architects in a field where architects have not exactly been so active in the, let's say, in the last century. So, so I want to get to what exactly you want to do then in these areas. And to start this discussion, maybe we also look at a difference between the two projects and the research, which is scale, that the Achtung, die Landschaft is a lot about mapping Switzerland. And so it's a small country in the middle of Europe, which is which you have looked at like for more than a decade now. And then the scale of this project is vast, is much vaster, is actually the whole world, every instance you can find. So maybe you could say something about this. So where is that point of action in the difference of acting at the national versus at the global level? Maybe Jacques Herzog first on the Swiss project.
Basically, I think that architects all know each other's work. So I knew the kind of Switzerland kind of project kind of very well. And I would say that really is a project. What we did is not really a project. It's also not really an agenda. It is kind of basically more an alarm. And it is an inventory of different phenomena that you can see in the countryside. If you look carefully and particularly if you interpret them. Jacques is right in saying that the influence of cities in the countryside is kind of really huge, and that that in itself is a threat to the countryside. But we also looked not only at the influence of cities, but simply at the implications of the current discourse and the current preoccupation, for instance, with the digital. And if you look, for instance, at the kind of effects of Silicon Valley on the landscapes in California and in Nevada, but also in the landscape Europe, in the landscapes in Asia, you see enormous boxes, enormous kind of almost completely abstract kind of entities that have never existed at that scale before, and that kind of simply exist almost without habitation kind of in the world. So that was one category of things we looked at. We also...
can I interrupt just to explain in the exhibition, there is huge photographs showing these huge warehouses and production facilities in the desert. And you do claim somehow that these have not been shown and looked at by architects so far.
I wish I could drop the word claim, yeah, because actually I actually would like to assert that there is a kind of fundamental modesty about this whole effort. What we did, we found correspondents and kind of people who are inhabiting in those specific conditions and that were interested in reporting from them. It's kind of really an orchestration of maybe kind of 16 co-authors who have kind of worked to create a kind of collective portrait. And the idea of claim is kind of suggesting an ownership or an ambition of ownership. It's more a series of alarms and kind of massive surprises that we wanted to convey.
Yeah, and it's correct.
Well,
on the title,
anyway,
it says
but
report is on the title of the book. But I think Jacques Herzog probably wants to say,
I mean, Rem, you say nobody has ever looked at the landscape before in such a way, and this is of course not true. But
Jacques, I nowhere say that. Sorry.
Okay.
I do not say no one looked at the landscape.
Okay. Anyway, but I unfortunately I haven't seen the exhibition. I saw the catalog, and I think we share. I think the let's say I feel scared also when I see what happens with these vast plants that are spreading, these kind of inhuman or absence of human driven plants worldwide. That's one thing. But what worries me even more, and that is something we have seen, because we have not only looked at the landscape in Switzerland, we have, for instance, done an extensive study on the Nile Valley, and also we've done research in Nairobi. And what I think is really scary is the question of ownership. We have lost control. I mean, we, not architects namely, but the society at large, who owns the land. In cities, we are used to have properties owned by private people, by families, by companies, by whatever, by government. But outside cities, ownership has gone to even foreign countries. Ownership has gone to huge real estate trusts. And this is increasing the kind of, not I would say the neglection, but the exploitation of land and landscape and territory. And these are things that are increasingly, of course, limiting our free societies. The notion of digitalization is, of course, invading landscapes as much as it does in cities. And I think those aspects are really scary, and they are, in fact, out of the control of the architects. They have always been out of the control of the architects, but we can discuss what the role could be of the architect. I think, indeed, it's important that maybe we cannot spread visions anymore because they've all failed anyway, but we can do eventually projects which reveal that problematic situation of unknown ownership or hidden ownership. And that aspect of landscape is something that I think could be a field for architecture in the future.
So what you're just saying is that the inventory is the project, that both of you, I think, don't want to...
I think there's an important part of the inventory, which is that I documented how in the 20th century, a number of political regimes had absolutely explicit agendas in terms of what to do with the countryside. And I made an extensive collage where you see that there was political thinking in Europe in the 20s. There was political thinking in Europe, of course, about the status of the countryside all during the creation of the European Union. There was political thinking in the Arab world. There was political thinking in Stalin and in China. And what I think you see is in the past maybe 3 decades, or maybe since the fall of the Berlin Wall, a very serious kind of reduction of political attention in general, of political attention to the countryside, almost complete withdrawal of politics from the countryside. And that is what I think Jacques is also about. And basically I was showing in the exhibition that only 50 years ago, that situation was completely different. And that's why I keep hammering on the kind of political aspect of the whole thing, kind of rather than any other architectural action. We can only, and I would say that the same thing has happened to our cities too. I think that the neoliberal system has first in a way denatured our cities and is now denaturing nature, but it's part of a similar process.
So you wish that
yeah, I think it's an important point that you mentioned. You mentioned all these past empires of socialism and communism, which have had somehow fascinating but also frightening concept for the landscape. And I don't know whether we wish to go back to that, but I think that we should go back or go to in the future, try to claim the land as being owned by everybody and not by these groups that I mentioned before. We should try to map it. And this is going back to Switzerland. Switzerland was one of the early countries which totally mapped its landscape. I think Holland is also mainly artificially built landscape. So the notion of mapping, of defining, describing every little piece meticulously is quite interesting before we do a project, because it's already naming it and giving it a role. And I think that's behind our intention, giving it a role in that we didn't, let's say, distribute typologies in Switzerland because we wanted them to be like that, but we looked at them and said they have an interesting potential to be, let's say, empty, or they have a potential to be metropolitan or whatever. So we didn't impose anything from outside as planners, but we suggested giving them a name and being like a personality in its own, which defines the borders to the cities and not vice versa. I think that the border, the name of the border, is also a typical name. I don't see it in the medieval way of a wall against something else. But yes, borders have increasingly gained an importance because borders have come back, especially also in the mind of people. And I think that we cannot avoid the discussion about borders and limitations, which again is then linked to this idea of names, of giving an identity. And what was missing is that the land or the territory did not have an identity, could not speak on the same level with the cities or with metropolitan areas as cities could towards the landscape. I think we have like to reverse that role. And I think that's something that architects can do. Architects can give names to things. And I think that would be, for me, like the beginning of a potentially new role that we could play around the world.
Jacques Herzog, you also wrote in your book, border is the place of intervention. That is where architects actually can take action. And so how do you describe these borders? Or are they clear? Are they getting blurred?
No, I think getting blurred or clear, this is not the point. I think that borders is, let's say, it's a zone. The question is, if you have a border, if you have a wall, which is one of the earliest tools that humans had when they settled down, did agriculture. There was something on this side, there was something on the other side. This is a fact. This is a very human condition. I'm interested in this human condition also on a psychological level. And it's important that both sides have an importance. Both sides can speak together. But what happens with so-called landscape is that it doesn't have a name. It was residual. It was outside. It was what was left over. And we worked on that question of how can we change that leftover into something which has its own words, its own language, its own identity. That's my interest in borders. It's not the border per se, but it is this kind of equivalent importance of things. That's, I think, is a very actual, and it's a very contemporary question, and is important when now, with the melting of large parts of Northern Europe and the rest of the world, when new land will be visible and become visible, what happens to these parts of the world, of the planet? And this question of all of a sudden something is here and it does have no name and everybody jumps on it. I think this is not a question of neglected, it is a question of describing it and giving it a role, giving it an importance, taking it serious. It's almost a racial question.
So can we still apply the term of border when we talk about the duality of city and countryside? Rem?
I really think that I would like to kind of really resist acting like an architect. For me, the issue is absolutely not how architects can reclaim anything or kind of reposition themselves or any strictly architectural term. I think that eventually our repertoire is enormous, and if the situation is right, we can do significant things. But I think that currently the context is completely alien or completely hostile to the idea of any of these considerations. Let's take Holland. When I was young in Holland, there was a kind of ministry that had as its only function to order the country spatially. Yeah, it was ruimtelijke ordening, spatial ordering. That has been abandoned. There was a ministry for housing that has been abandoned. So it's kind of simply every political ordering system has been abandoned. And that is the chaotic situation in which we are now all having to kind of operate. And of course, we can operate with more or less intelligence and more or less kind of sophistication. But I think that the really crucial thing is to try to work on a kind of more political framework, because without that, and that is also an implication of the countryside, it's not only let's say a statement about the world in its current form and or what architects could contribute to it. It's also the situation that the world is facing a kind of hair-raising dilemma, and that we know essentially what needs to be done kind of in order to address the dilemma, but that we have kind of simply abandoned the institutions or the entities that can help us deal with these dilemmas. So again, I would emphasize the political dimension of the kind of show is much stronger than any architectural element of it.
No, I think we can assert that both of you do involve into politics with these research, and I still insist that since there are 4 architects on this panel, I want to come back to this dialectic between the city and the countryside that is the main topic here. So, and I'll just throw in a hypothesis that another difference between your research, other than the scale, is that Rem Koolhaas in the Guggenheim in the Guggenheim exhibition, the research that led to that, I still read it very much as a movement from the city to the countryside, that your obsession was with the city, and now you're trying to take control over the sprawl that this energy from the city exerts over the countryside. And then the vice versa, Jacques Herzog, I think your writing, and also you've said that repeatedly, is an interest in taking the landscape back into the city. So that is the opposite direction. that we are saying we need more nature in the cities to make that density more diverse. So how do you, maybe you can just react to this hypothesis that the movement is inverse in your work?
Sabine, would you be really happy if we presented ourselves as total opposites?
No.
because that
Yeah, we started. No, we'll come back to the parallels at the end. I think the choreography is that now we're going to the diversity, to the differences.
But could I help to bring it together?
Yes.
yes.
Hypothesis, do we have to build the countryside to save it? Because the construction has started, as you have shown, Rem, and you also, Jacques. And I mean, the strategy of Jacques is to build the landscape first. As Central Park, to coming back to the years in New York, was first, and then there were the building lots. It's a very conservative, maybe, strategy, but it's about borders and it's about conserving and building very dynamically. So don't we have to build to save? Question. So that means...
I don't think so.
Okay.
You know, for me, the irony is that we are discussing kind of building more in the countryside, but as I said, there is a current process going on where a world, a territory that is inhabited right now by half of mankind, in 30 years will be, in terms of human beings, be halved, diminished by half. And so that in itself doesn't already shows it's not an issue of kind of building, but it's an issue of conceptualizing what the role of that, Jacques just called it residue, of that kind of residue kind of represents, and what can we do with it, and how can we, and clearly that question is also a question that is crucial in terms of dealing with global warming. How can we kind of make sure that we even abandon certain parts in a creative way so that they can become nature and that they can help to overcome global warming. So I don't think it's remotely an issue of building, or, but it's purely an issue of conceptualizing a new way in which it's created. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at Africa or kind of China, where almost any kind of urban citizen has a foot in both camps, you know, kind of lives in the city, but also has a background in the countryside. In China, that is also the case. So I think that one thing which might be kind of much more productive if we kind of develop a situation where any kind of citizen has in some way an engagement with the two conditions, an engagement with part of the countryside and an engagement in the city. But for me, the issue is really how can the vast majority of the world be kind of inhabited in a different way by fewer people.
I think a lot of this discussion would, within the day that Ingemar and Anna orchestrate, is to also see where do we need new definitions. And I think you're trying to get at, to Ingemar, you're trying to find this, we're getting to the final, you're trying to also find, do we need new terms for, say, the young countryside? Do we, what is this relationship? So I think in that,
I just wanted to say, I don't want to leave it to the huge trusts, but, and we, of course we have to build, doesn't mean that we have to plan, of course. We have to be very intelligent by planning, and we have to maybe building on the build where it is already built, of course, but don't leave it just, but go there and build. But of course, it's not, that's not driven by it, my wish to build, but not to leave it to the way it's done today, where there are no architects. And I was not totally sure if, Rem, you had a kind of a joyful pessimism or a sad pessimism. I was not quite sure.
Basically, what I've been trying to do in this kind of exhibition is to show kind of episodes that are actually interesting and the basis for pessimism, and other episodes that are could be a basis for pessimism. And for instance, we looked kind of very carefully at new forms of agriculture and kind of discovered that there is a kind of massive movement to use digitalization kind of for a more refined and more ecological agriculture also, so that the digital is being used in two radically opposite ways. One, an abusive way to extract from the earth the absolute maximum at the expense of the earth, and the other way to be careful, subtle, and to kind of see how a kind of much richer kind of way of agriculture can both maintain the ground and can maintain ecology. So again, it's not all pessimistic or all optimistic. There is kind of evidence of the two. I was simply trying to show the kind of richness of the current situation and the perplexity of the current situation.
If we talk about agriculture, we have done 2 or 3 semesters based on food, and we have researched how much land cities need around them to feed the populations, and based on certain assumptions of what people are eating, etc., etc. And that's extremely interesting, how you can cut the total surfaces when you don't eat meat or you eat less meat, etc., etc. That's one side, which is in a traditional way using land for traditional forms of agriculture. When you change that, and there are many, many interesting projects on the way, and some are realized, where you cultivate agriculture indoor, even in towers. And this is a highly urban activity, actually, which produces an artificial, very seductive, actually, artificial landscape within cities. That's part of the kind of idea that is behind when I said that we should bring more landscape in cities and activate it even as something which is also very attractive for people. So there is a lot of things which is actually not in the hands of architects, but has its own beauty on its own. And this is something certainly that is an instrument, or something that at least as planners, or let's say to inspire politicians and entrepreneurs to use that more as an active tool. We look at city planning and doing buildings in a too traditional way, which is not fit to face the new technologies which are around.
I think agriculture is a very good keyword to come to another parallel that I think I don't try to cast you as opposites, but I think somehow I'm trying to find what is complementary in the two ways you work. And one way of getting to that is actually biographical, that in Switzerland we have this policy that is still in place, that a lot of land is reserved for growing potatoes in a state of emergency, whereas I think in Holland there is this high-tech agriculture that I think you grew up with, and that is the final, the exhibition ends with this high-tech agriculture. So this whole so I think there you come from really from different backgrounds, and the question is do you think that that your biographies in Switzerland and in Holland have actually informed the way you look at the landscape?
Jacques, you go first.
Oh, Jacques muss Mikrofon anmachen.
Yeah. Well, Rem and I, we've really talked a lot together and also in public, and it's really not so easy to avoid being put against each other, which is of course less interesting than finding common lines, especially in the moment when we were working together. So I think of course, Holland and Switzerland are totally different topographies, and one country has produced Mondrian, whose horizontal and abstract lines would not have been possible, I think, if he hadn't been exposed to the kind of landscape that you find in Holland. And Giacometti is the opposite almost. But I think the more interesting thing is that the final product is really great, whether it comes from this or that origin. That's far less interesting. I'm sure that somehow every human is inspired and has a very specific situation. And you know that I'm very much believing in the specific as a fundamental rule in society and in our history. But I never saw it as a real benefit. I rather saw it as a disease. So if you grow up somewhere, you are also somehow bound to this place, whether you want it or not. But somehow something sticks in your mind and inspires or influences at least what you do in the future.
I think the beautiful thing of the current moment is that everyone has, of course, their original context and sensibility, but we also have an unbelievable exposure to many other sensibilities, kind of simply because of the globalization and the opportunity to enter territories and have an intimate relationship with territories that we would never have known even 50 years ago. So yes, of course it has an influence, but I'm also equally deeply influenced by the kind of step of Russia, where you can really have a deep confrontation with nothingness, simply because of the incredible scale. And so yes, of course it is characterized us, but I would say not too deeply, and I would say we are both characterized already more by the opportunities of this moment to actually explore the rest of the world. Which, by the way, I hope will kind of remain intact after this crisis.
So in the end, it is about saving the world in a certain way, no? So then if you had to create a formula, is it then the understanding of technology that can save us, or is it a higher sense of beauty that can save us?
I think all of the above. I think politics, technology, sensibility, artistic drives, agriculture, farming. It's kind of really not a kind of single entity. It's the combination of all of them.
I totally agree. I think especially I would highlight on science. Science is, without science we would not survive. And I think that's a bit also a problematic situation, that science and what we used to call Aufklärung has lost a lot of influence. And even in this crisis, I see scenarios of people who are pretending things, who are against vaccines, and it's amazing what kind of evil powers seem to reappear, and you will never be able to avoid that. But nevertheless, I think that it's a big role that we would attribute to science and industry in the creation of landscape and description of landscape.
I enjoy that we come to the end with the enlightenment and some optimism. Yeah.
But I agree there. So I'm kind of happy because it's kind of not the artificiality which is the thing to emphasize in Holland or in Switzerland. It's also the contribution of science. And actually, the exhibition, if you allow me to correct something, didn't end on Dutch agriculture, but on a laboratory in Germany where they are getting closer and closer on kind of realizing fusion, the alternative form of nuclear energy. So I think that we really stuck our neck out in making the claim also for the importance of science and how science will be crucial in the next 30 years.
Before we then come to the final ultimate question, I do want to get to the Engadin, which is the beginning of the exhibition, which is also a place, like I know that you've shared offices in on the Astor Place project in New York, so, but you also have spent your vacation in the same valley, in the Engadin Valley, which you said this is where it triggered your interest in the countryside, and Jacques, you have looked at the Engadin also closely in your research. So
yes, basically it was I had the kind of privilege to be in Engadin kind of maybe 3 times a year for 15 years, and basically that, because I was there such a kind of regular visitor, I was much better able to kind of record differences there and changes there than anywhere else. Because, and actually I have to admit that I thought that Switzerland was initially a kind of almost a permanent given that was not totally submitted to this kind of constant change that we know in the kind of rest of Northern Europe. And then I kind of began to realize slowly but surely that actually Switzerland is kind of changing incredibly fast, and therefore Engadin was a beautiful place to observe that. And in the kind of text I wrote for this catalog, I think that kind of about 25% is about Switzerland. So yes, that Engadin is something we have in common. Although I never visited Jacques there, I only know the kind of urban Jacques and not the kind of rural Jacques. Yeah?
I think that the Engadin is an interesting example of my worries about landscape, that we have, if I simplify it, looked at the Swiss landscape and found out that there are 2 kinds. One is the kind of resort, alpine resort, which is clearly Engadin, which is Gstaad, which is Zermatt. And then the kind of abandoned, neglected, the kind of left over, where, let's say, young generations have left remote valleys and have left it alone. And we created this term of Brachen, wasteland, that was politically shocking. You know, it was discussed politically, so that was one of the few times when architects are being listened by politicians. And this is certainly also through visiting regularly areas like the Engadin, which is of course the spoiled, the most beautiful, the totally urbanized. It's like actually like a city which sometimes is pumping itself up hugely and is like an extension of Zurich or Basel, and then it collapses and breaks down and is totally abandoned. Restaurants are closed. It's actually quite horrible in this in-between seasons. And other areas are totally left over. And maybe with, let's say, new working methods that people have been learning now during this crisis, some of these villages may be resettled again, which I think would be a good idea, to bring back some life to these areas. So that would be now something, or an example, let's say, where I'm quite in favor of giving landscape a new role and bringing the city also to the landscape, so to speak. Because in fact, Switzerland is so small that the cities reach out and make it grow and shrink and grow and shrink. And I'm sure that, Rem, this is what you witnessed in your 15 years visiting at the Engadin. It's a dramatic transformation of the landscape.
I think the Engadin dialogue has to continue because the 25% is actually questions, right?
Yeah.
25% about Engodin is only questions, so it's now unfinished. So I think Ingemar wants us to wrap up. So I will ask, I think in many ways this question has been answered. It was the final question in the conference, in the brief for today that Anna and Ingemar wrote, but I just want you to end with statements reacting to this big question. And so the question how they wrote it is, city, countryside, and nature, are they dialectical opposites or are they symbiotic systems? I know you have answered this already partially, but maybe we can wrap up with a statement here.
I think that kind of right now it would be very productive to consider them as a kind of in a kind of single framework and not as opposites for the moment. And there may be a time that it's kind of useful again, but I think that today it's kind of really crucial to look at the kind of overall picture rather than built on an opposition. Would be my instinct.
I totally agree. That's why I think that we should give landscape or look at landscape in a more mature way. That something is equivalent to the city. Only then it is can be really seen in one frame. Otherwise, it's still this kind of residual, this kind of leftover. And this is ultimately certainly something that we share, you know, even if in text or descriptions or in how people look at it or analyze what one says from outside, it may seem different. It's also sometimes not so easy to summarize or bring something on the point. This person has this opinion, this has this other opinion. I think it's important that we use, that we look at architecture not only from, let's say, a single building, but we look basically at its implications on society and at politics. And that's certainly something that basically we share.
So the symbiotic systems is the answer to your question anymore.
Thank you very much. I think you have more parallels in the midst of the, we suppose in the midst of the talk, and I feel a deep, humility really. And you know, on the one hand, there were really humble statements about how and what can architecture do, and on the other hand, I heard that we have to be to have a wide scope, and this is the generalist. Seems like the other nature, and it's the typical nature of the architect, and so I think this is like the tension in between. We have to be humble generalists. I don't know if this is right, but there that's how I felt you today, and also the younger generations, if I may so say, which were in front of you, like Jan de Wilde, I take him, he said, we have to think about the could, now and then, but we have to solve the can. We have to think about what we can do now. And so it's both. It's like to survive and to make it also a better place, not just to survive, because we're human beings. So, and I heard both of you saying that, and I think it was a great talk. Thanks a lot for your time.
Maybe we have 2 more minutes and we can come back to the architecture question that is also in the tradition of this Dortmund Architecture Days. Is it now, you both your research implies that architects have to engage in politics, but then both your careers show that the designing of actual buildings and of form and also of beauty, as you said, that is part of the game, how we could change and save the world. So are we abandoning what Koolhaas did in the 70s now? Is this a new era?
I don't think it's kind of a matter of abandoning at all. But I think that we have to at the same time both focus and maintain and explore new territories. So it's simply you know, it's the opposite of entropy. Entropy is kind of when everything becomes denser and doesn't open up and doesn't have any kind of new information or new givens. It's a kind of basically an issue of vitality also to extend the kind of range and to try to constantly extend it.
Jacques, you want to answer?
Jacques, last statement.
I think at the end of the day, architects cannot go to politics. This is boring because you become an advocate for something. You should be held back in this question. I think that's also certainly not what Rem would like to do, become the president of Holland or somewhere else. And I think the project...
Definitely not of Holland.
Okay. Yeah, at least not of La Maddalena. That would be a good idea. No, but I think that ultimately the vision, or let's say the propaganda that some architects have used as a tool in the past is also not a good tool. But I think the project, but not in the traditional way, the project in a vast way, which describes potentials, is a tool that we can use and we should use. And research, the way Rem has done it and the way we have done it, is certainly at the basis of possible great projects. Because they open also perspectives, you know. A project is not always a description of a way how to build something, but is a way how to look at things, is based on perception. And perception is based on you personally, physically looking at things and not taking things from books only and then make your interpretation. But you go somewhere, you look at things, and that's the basis of then what the project can be in a very wide sense of the word.
Thank you. Nice ending. We've already lost Rem. Thank you.
We lost Rem in the wind. And yeah, again, my thank to you all, Jacques, who is still here, Rem, who has left, and Sabine. It was very interesting. I think we could go on and your work will go on, I hope, and investigate further. And we will have to deal with these spaces. So thanks a lot. I see Hans Koloff is already in the...
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.